Envision, if you will, an absolute, unadulterated silence. Not the tranquil silence of a fading dusk, but a viscous, leaden stillness that crushes your ribcage beneath dozens of yards of frigid limestone. The anemic, flickering glow of a hurricane lantern casts its sickly light against the weeping walls of the cavern, illuminating a tableau capable of fracturing the sanity of any man. 98 antiquated, threadbare leather satchels, arranged with mathematical precision into immaculate rows within the abyssal belly of the earth. 97 of them have languished there for a century, and the 98th, pristine, its brass buckles still gleaming, sitting solitary like a willing sacrificial offering. I want you to ask yourself one question before we truly begin. What raises the hackles on the back of your neck more? An ancient, malevolent entity lurking in the abyssal dark, swallowing 97 grown men without so much as a blink? Or the reality that, a full century later, a modern, ordinary man would carry his own satchel, walk down into that Stygian maw, obediently seat himself, and bury himself alive without uttering a single plea for mercy? If you have ever prowled the obscure forums dedicated to the paranormal, or listened to whispered campfire morbidities, you have undoubtedly heard of the Aldous Hargrove expedition of 1823. They speak of 97 men who marched into the desolate Ozark highlands, only to be vaporized from the face of the earth by some vindictive spiritual force enraged by their trespass. They whisper of a descent into madness chronicled in journals, of grotesque geometric symbols carved into the stone, of a mountain that drew breath and dined on human flesh. Before we pry open this yellowed dossier, I must speak to you with the blunt sobriety of a man who has squandered his youth excavating the macabre. I do not buy into that cheap, spectral ghost story. Not because I am a rigid atheist incapable of fear, but because that supernatural script violates the most fundamental tenets of criminology and the human psyche. Apply a modicum of logic for a moment. Do you suppose an ancient monstrosity dwelling in a subterranean abyss possesses the administrative acumen to wipe out the accounting ledgers of the United States government? Does a spectral entity have any conceivable use for a colossal fortune of solid gold, tons of exorbitant supplies, and the most robust draft horses of a surveying fleet? No. Monsters possess no concept of liquidating assets, and demons do not orchestrate the construction of prosperous towns upon the sunlit earth. Only the bottomless avarice of mankind is capable of such feats. The truth interred beneath the limestone of the Ozarks is bloodier and infinitely more repulsive than any demonic folklore you have ever consumed. When confronted with an insoluble historical tragedy, we are easily blinded by the mystique of the supernatural. We would rather console ourselves with the belief that some demonic entity intervened, rather than confront a merciless reality that the true devil wears the face of our fellow man is merely an architectural facade erected to conceal the artificial facade of the bal tratuses of the victors. Welcome to Appalachian Horror Stories. Pour yourself a strong bitter cup of coffee, bolt the doors, because tonight we are going to flay the rotting supernatural epidermis off the 1823 case, to stare directly into the ocular depths of betrayal, karmic retribution, and the most diabolical scheme of pro-revenge that American history ever unwittingly recorded. The most grandiose secrets of deception are rarely blown wide open by a thunderous explosion. They are typically fractured by something infinitesimal, exceedingly mundane, silent yet violently misaligned with the natural order of things. Our narrative does not commence in that blood-soaked year of 1823, but rather on a pallid, bone-chilling morning, November 19, 1957. In a minuscule, ostensibly innocuous county named Dent, nestled in the southern reaches of Missouri. The winter of that year was bizarrely brutal. The ceaseless, miserable rains that persisted throughout October had transformed the topsoil upon the porous Ozark limestone into a sodden, weeping sponge. When the initial hard freeze seized the land in mid-November, the earth began to contract and contort in ways that the most seasoned agrarians had never witnessed. Everywhere reports surfaced of fissures and minor topographical collapses, but the sinkhole that ruptured the property of veterinarian Cormac Stroud was not minor, nor did it resemble any natural geological accident. It was 7 in the morning. The heavens were a wan, viscous gray, resembling the hue of a tarnished lead coin. Cormac Stroud, A gaunt, 44-year-old man, bearing the weathered austerity of one accustomed to solitary labor in the pre-dawn shadows, was executing his customary perimeter walk along the barbed wire encircling his acreage. His exhalations materialized as thick milky plumes in the biting air, and then as he rounded a copse of ancient oaks, he froze. Right there, where the evening prior had laid a perfectly flat, frost-kissed stretch of meadow, now gaped an open, horrific laceration in the earth, a gargantuan crater. It spanned roughly 30 feet across, its surface circumference near perfectly circular, plunging downward like an ebony funnel, and at the bottom of that 22-foot drop, amidst the freshly collapsed rubble of soil and stone, a dark, ominous archway revealed itself. The entrance to a cave. I need you to pause right here, draw a deep breath, and inject yourself into the psychological shoes of Cormac Stroud. If you were a farmer waking one morning to find half your backyard swallowed by a chasm and deep enough, or tractor, what would be your physiological response? Panic, perhaps? Would you scramble backward, terrified the precipice might continue to crumble? Would you sprint wildly into your house, frantically dialing the county sheriff, or at the very least, summon the fire department to barricade the crater to spare your livestock from a fatal plummet? These are the instinctual, hardwired reactions of the human animal when confronted with a natural catastrophe, but not Cormac Stroud. According to his own subsequent testimony, Stroud stood rooted to the lip of the abyss, motionless in the bone-cleaving cold. He stooped, retrieved a stone the size of his fist, dropped it into the blinding dark of the pit, and pricked his ears to trace the acoustic ricochet of its impact against the subterranean walls. Then he turned his back, walked into the house, placidly poured himself a steaming mug of coffee, and only then took a leisurely drive into the county seat to seek out the local land surveyor, Apprentice Ogilvy. Do you catch the scent of the grotesque anomaly here? Stroud's conduct is not the behavior of a man who has stumbled blindly upon a geological mishap. It is the behavior of a man who has just taken delivery of a grim parcel he has been anticipating for a very long time, yet desperately wished would never arrive. The manner in which he tossed the stone was not an exercise in depth measurement. It was a wary, probing interrogation of the darkness. Stroud did not panic because he vaguely, inherently knew what the chasm contained. It was no mere landslide. It was a summons for debt collection, issued directly from the underworld. Apprentice Ogilvy, the county land surveyor, was the second actor to step onto this theatrical stage. Upon hearing Stroud recount the cavern, Ogilvy did not dispatch a report to the state authorities, nor did he mobilize additional manpower. He simply stowed a 100-foot coil of rope, a handful of flashlights, and a hurricane lantern into the trunk of his vehicle, and drove himself to the Stroud property in the waning hours of that very afternoon. They lashed the rope to an oak trunk. Ogilvy rappelled incrementally into the abyssal maw while Stroud anchored the line from above. The atmosphere below was suffocating, reeking of damp earth, of stagnant, archaic aquifers, and of a metallic, claustrophobic stench born of centuries devoid of circulating air. Ogilvy was forced to crawl on hands and knees through a constricting tunnel, the razor-sharp limestone lariating the shoulders of his coat, the rocky ceiling pressing down upon his chest as though aching to pulverize him. Then the passage dilated, a colossal subterranean vault. The ceiling soared to 30 feet, the expanse equivalent to a small amphitheater. The amber beam of the lantern sliced through the hazy suspension of damp dust, exposing formations of stalactites that hung like grotesque fangs driven into the cavern floor. But the sight that snagged Ogilvy's breath in his throat was not the terrifying majesty of nature. Nestled precisely in the geometric dead center of that unnaturally level cavern floor lay the artifacts of men. 97 leather satchels. The historical ledgers document that Ogilvy described the tableau with a profound shudder, but peer closely at the meticulous choreography of that scene. 97 leather satchels, engineered to carry surveying instruments, compasses, and journals from the early 19th century. Every single one was fastened tight, its brass buckles meticulously secured, and they were not scattered. They had not been violently hurled or abandoned in a paroxysm of blind terror. They were arrayed in immaculate rows, 7 to a line. The spatial intervals between the satchels, measured in every conceivable direction, were a uniform 3 feet. arranged with the rigid precision of a macroscopic, sepulchral chessboard drowned in the gloom of a catacomb. It is at this exact juncture that, for decades, the purveyors of ghost stories have weaponized the silence of those 97 satchels to paint a mural of cosmic dread. They assert that the surveyors, their minds hijacked by an esoteric force, docilely organized their belongings before stepping into the eternal void, hand in hand with the devil. But my eyes perceive something entirely different. When I scrutinize the schematic of that crime scene, harboring the mindset of a forensic reader, I see a gargantuan blind spot that the investigators of 1957 deliberately elected to ignore. Entertain the thought. The human animal, cornered by an apocalyptic event, be it an avalanche of stone, the gnawing hollow of starvation, or an aberrant abominations slithering up from the bowels of the earth, finds its survival instincts brutally hijacking every ounce of tidiness and logic. They will scream. They will claw at the unyielding rock faces until their fingernails snap and bleed. Gear will be violently strewn about. Pages will be frantically shredded in a desperate bid to kindle a fire or map an escape. 97 men staring into the jagged maw of death never, and I emphasize never, possessed the leisure nor the psychological composure to measure a 3-foot clearance between every leather bag, and then delicately fasten every brass clasp as though preparing for a military inspection. This theater of the macabre does not radiate the frantic hysteria of victims hunted by the supernatural. It radiates the frigid, sadistic control and the neurotic calculation of a mind plagued by obsessive-compulsive disorder, or a perpetrator deliberately choreographing a psychological pantomime to bewilder anyone who might follow. It is far too sterile, far too flawless. It reeks of deliberate, premeditated staging. It is akin to a butcher who fastidiously scrubs away the arterial spray with alcohol, then places a singular long-stemmed rose upon the corpse, ensuring that when law enforcement arrives, they become hypnotized by the surreal symbolism of the flower rather than hunting for the actual murder weapon. And there is yet another bizarre anomaly, an absurdity stacked atop an absurdity. Upon unearthing what should rightfully be hailed as the most monumental archaeological revelation of the century, what did Ogilvy do? Did he sprint to the surface to alert the authorities? No, both Ogilvy and Strauhaud assumed this secret for weeks on end. They took turns creeping back down into that sepulchre. They brought measuring tapes. They swept their flashlight beams over each satchel without daring to breach a single buckle. They stood paralyzed amidst 97 relics of the dead drowning in a silence so profound it prickled the skin, and they muttered in hushed conspiratorial whispers. It wasn't until December 8th, nearly a full month later, that they finally deigned to notify the State Historical Society. What was the purpose of their procrastination? A rational human being would flee that subterranean mausoleum with all the haste they could muster, unless they did not view it as the crypt of strangers. Unless, during those 3 agonizing weeks, bathed in the sickly amber of the hurricane lantern and hemmed in by the dust-choked ranks of leather, Stroud and Ogilvy were violently wrestling with the digestion of a revolting truth. A truth that the stone Stroud dropped on the morning of November 19th had awakened. They were not exploring an esoteric mystery. They were staring unblinkingly at the butchery committed by their own forefathers, desperately calculating whether they could manage to bury it all over again. To fathom why 97 satchels sat in an alignment so flawless it curdles the blood, and why 2 20th-century men sweated cold terror instead of contacting the police, we cannot simply gaze from the rim of the sinkhole. We must seize the hands of the clock and wrench them backward, returning to the 14th of March, 1823. We must trace the trajectory of the phantom gold coins that never graced a single official ledger, and we must flay the mask from the true visage of the expedition's vanguard, Aldous Hargrove, because a monster has no earthly use for a measuring tape. But a traitor certainly does. Allow your mind to slide away from the brain-piercing chill of the 1957 cavern. Close your eyes, shake off the mildewed stench of the dust-draped leather satchels, and draw a deep inhalation to taste the atmosphere of a bygone epoch. The air of March 1823 was thick, coagulated with fog, choking on the rancid, sour perspiration of dozens of draft horses, the aroma of rain-logged leather, the acrid, biting smoke of damp firewood, and an invisible razor-sharp scent that insidiously corroded human reason, the stench of greed. When the digital folklorists whisper to one another of the expedition's vanishing, they often, whether by accident or design, sketch an image of 97 fragile men in tattered cloaks, trembling as they clutch pathetic little torches, wandering aimlessly into an ominous, darkened wood. They romanticize weakness, but historical reality is far more abrasive, coarse, and immensely heavy. 97 robust, meticulously selected men did not constitute a leisurely walking party. That is the scale of a military company. Can you visualize the sheer physical mass of a military company? Listen closely to their cacophony. It was not the hush of stealthy footsteps, but the brutal grinding of iron-rimmed wooden wheels skidding out of rhythm over jagged limestone. It was the ear-splitting, metallic clatter of heavy, solid iron surveyors' chains slamming against the wagon beds with every violent jolt. The concussive thud of sledgehammers driving stakes echoed through the ravines. They hauled massively thick canvas tents, brutally heavy from absorbing the frost, oak barrels densely packed with salted pork, sacks of flour coated in a chalky white dust. They carried rifles, black powder pickaxes, and exorbitantly priced brass navigational instruments swaddled in velvet, and most crucially, the one artifact every paranormal dossier suspiciously omits: they carried money. The United States government, or more specifically the Department of the Interior, would never deploy such a colossal civilian army into the feral heart of the Ozark Plateau with empty pockets. To sustain the survival and logistical demands of nearly 100 men marooned from civilization for months on end, Aldous Hargrove was entrusted with absolute dominion over a staggering operational treasury. These were not worthless paper promissory notes to be brandished in a toxic, untamed will. This was solid gold. These were dense, freezing, heavy-cast silver dollars, hermetically sealed in steel-reinforced oak strong boxes, to distribute periodic wages, to purchase the navigational guidance of sparse settlers, or to barter for provisions from French traders along the secluded trails. Now pivot back to that midsummer day in 1823, when the search and rescue detachment breached the highlands and stumbled upon 6 abandoned base camps. The official dispatch noted that everything was pervaded by a profoundly wrong stillness. Tents still stood, their canvas straining against the wind. Personal effects, surveying tools, mud-caked boots, and a handful of notebooks were strewn about. There were no signs of a struggle, no splatter of blood. This disturbingly clinical disappearance became prime bait for the disciples of spiritualism. They shrieked that a monster had drained the life essence from the men without so much as disturbing a single boot. Yet there exists a mute, screaming truth, a gargantuan void in that report that no one ever bothers to drag into the light. The rescue party meticulously inventoried the discarded footwear, but not a solitary line documented the whereabouts of the iron-bound strong boxes containing the treasury. There was no record of recovering dozens of pack horses and draft mules. Not a trace was found of the hundreds of pounds of explosive powder, nor the prohibitively expensive, gold-plated brass compasses. An ancient, gelatinous leviathan, clinging to the subterranean shadows hundreds of yards deep, waiting to devour human souls to satiate a millennial hunger. Would it require silver currency? Does an abomination need horses to haul its cargo, or does it crave a mouthful of gold coins over the crunch of human bone? Monsters harbor no fascination for precious metals. They lack the cognitive capacity to comprehend a treasury. No demon in the infernal pit has ever required the payroll of the American Department of the Interior. Only humanity is capable of liquidating assets. The stillness of the camp was not the lingering residue of dark sorcery. It was the profound silence of a crime scene that had been flawlessly scrubbed of everything retaining commercial exchange value. The very second the rescue party failed to locate the remuda of horses and the chests of coin, the ghostly mythology shattered, abdicating its throne to the singular, most primal, and putrescent motive known to mankind: greed. And to comprehend how that avarice took root and germinated amidst the flesh-rending chill of the Ozarks, we must rip the mask from the maestro who conducted this symphony of atrocities, Aldous Hargrove. The historical tomes and the morbid internet babblada depict Hargrove as a serene, philosophical hermit of the woods, a stoic man who deciphered the land as one reads a musical score, laboring purely for passion and devotion. How utterly laughable! That is merely the veneer society paints over the deceased to amplify the tragedy. Strip away that glittering lacquer and stare unflinchingly the essence of the man through the clinical lens of a psychological criminal profile. Aldous Hargrove was 51 years old. In an era where life expectancy hovered precariously at the threshold of 40, he was already an old man. His wife, Cornelia, had succumbed to a raging fever 5 years prior. He harbored no offspring, no extended kin, not a single tether binding him to the civilized world. Look closely at his hands. Hands the history books describe as gnarled, callus-ridden at the knuckles, marred by a labyrinth of scars across the palms, incapable of being scrubbed clean no matter the effort. Those are not the hands of a romantic who communes with nature. They are the hands of an indentured servant to his trade, a man who had sacrificed 30 grueling years dragging rusted iron chains through frozen mires, tasting the bitter ash of mud and frost, all to earn a meager government stipend. At 51, as his joints began to throb and ache with every nocturnal draught, Hargrove confronted a venomous truth. When this commission concluded, he would drag himself back to Washington with empty hands, a bent spine, and the grim prospect of dying of old age in the agonizing solitude of some squalid almshouse. His unwavering loyalty to the state had yielded nothing but a slow, creeping death. Now transplant that age-exhausted man, a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, into the heart of a savage plateau spanning thousands of square miles, where the concept of law had never so much as laid a footprint. Encircling him are abyssal ravines unknown to man, and dense forests of oak eager to swallow any dying scream. Under his absolute command are 96 lives sworn to unyielding obedience. And right there in his tent, shoved beneath his personal cot, sits the frigid iron strongbox harboring a colossal fortune, wealth sufficient to purchase an entirely new existence, a forged identity, an imperial future. It was this absolute severing from human society that catastrophically inverted Aldous Hargrove's moral compass. When buried in the deep woods, stripped of the prying eyes of capital bureaucrats, devoid of the iron grip of a local sheriff, the most magnificent, feral beast within the human soul stirs from its slumber. Hargrove sat in his tent, the wind shrieking through the cedar canopy, sounding like the lamentations of something ancient, but he paid no heed to the wind. Every sensory receptor he possessed was now violently narrowed to the abrasive, metallic scraping of silver coins grinding against one another with every jolt of the wagon wheel. The sensation of suffocation did not emanate from the vastness of the wild. It originated from the sheer, claustrophobic pressure within Hargrove's own chest. A thought began to take form, sluggish, viscous, like a droplet of water bleeding from the ceiling of a cave. What if this expedition were to suffer a tragic accident? What if this terrain, riddled with treacherous limestone death traps, just happened to swallow his entire battalion whole? No one would ever know. It took months for correspondents to stagger back to the capital. It would take months more for a rescue contingent to be mobilized. By the time they arrived, he would be thousands of miles away, wearing a different name, reveling in opulent luxury purchased with the blood and meat of those 96 men. Hargrove had no need to confront a monster. In the very instant that thought took root in the dead silence of his tent, as the icy brass of the compass bled into his scarred fingertips, he voluntarily mutated himself into the most terrifying predator the Ozarks had ever known. The unnatural stillness the surveyors began to perceive in early May of 1823. That prickly, chill, racing intuition that someone is standing right behind you and you know it without turning around, did not emanate from some supernatural entity awakening beneath the earth. They were gravely mistaken. They were confusing the breath of a demon with the unblinking stare of a predator. The thing that watched them intently every night, the thing evaluating each man, calculating the most surgically silent method of their extermination, was none other than their esteemed commander. Hargrove was calculating. He was measuring the exact tonnage of explosive powder required. He was quietly seeking out those who harbored a shared rot within their souls, recruiting them as accomplices to forge a minority potent enough to crush any resistance. The Ozark forest held no intrinsic malice, simply holding its breath, a mute witness to an atrociously brutal blueprint for mass murder slowly nearing its perfection. A betrayal born not in a frenzy of madness, but incubated in the blood-chilling composure of a man who knew he held the power of life and death. Monsters do not know how to scheme. Monsters do not engineer elaborate traps to legitimize the slaughter of dozens beneath the cloak of a paranormal anomaly. Only a human being, armed with a sophisticated brain and a heart blackened by lust, could direct a theatrical deception of such magnitude that it would force history itself to tremble in horror. And the ultimate stage for this blood-drenched opera was discovered by Hargrove in the architecture of a gargantuan limestone cavern. A pitch-black, freezing maw primed to swallow every last sin whole. A pitch-black, freezing maw primed to swallow every last sin whole. And the very first casualty to be chewed and digested by the suffocating claws of that colossal mouth was not human flesh, but the truth itself. Envision the inaugural moment when the historian Doratha Castle and surveyor apprentice Ogilvy gingerly unfastened the viridian-rusted brass buckle of one of those 97 leather satchels. The grating rasp of the desiccated, cracking leather echoed harshly within the subterranean crypt. A stagnant exhalation of air, pregnant with the rank odor of mildew, the dust of ages, and India ink that had bled dry over a century ago, blasted directly into their faces, stinging the nasal cavity. Within each satchel lay not bars of gold cryptic, otherworldly apparatus. It was a leather-bound notebook, 97 journals penned that had faded to a mottled, rusted iron hue, chronicling the final days of an expedition. As she read through those passages, Castle shuddered. Her official assessment, and subsequently the myriad of spine-tingling tales spun from it, cradled those journal entries as incontrovertible proof of demonic presence. People read aloud the sentences describing an invisible pressure, an atmosphere that was attentive rather than hostile, culminating in the grotesque serenity of the final pages. Hargrove had written, "The men are calm. Several have their eyes closed. Lauren is standing in the center of the chamber, his hands hanging at his sides, wearing an expression that under other circumstances I might call peaceful. I do not feel peaceful, but I notice that I am not afraid." Well, how utterly poetic, how deeply saturated in the hues of supernatural submission to some omnipotent sovereign of the cosmos. But I want you to close your eyes once more. Strip away the meager, romanticized illumination of the flickering candle and attempt to simulate the sensation of being entombed at the bottom of an abyssal cavern when the final hurricane lantern sputters out, starved of its last droplet of oil. Have you ever existed in a state of absolute pure darkness? It is nothing akin to closing your eyes to relax in your bedroom. In the deep earth, darkness possesses physical mass. It is gelatinous, oppressive. It bears down upon your eyeballs. Your pupils will dilate to the point of sheer agony, frantically attempting to wring a single photon of light from a void where none exists, inducing searing, explosive hallucinations that scorch the retina. Your eardrums, starved of any environmental acoustic input, will begin to violently amplify the internal mechanics of your own body. You will hear your heart hammering like a sledgehammer against your tympanic membrane. The rushing, chaotic torrent of blood through your veins, the high-pitched, desperate screech of a stomach contracting in the throes of starvation. The ambient temperature will plummet aggressively. The freezing moisture of the waterlogged limestone will bleed through your mud-caked coat, seeping directly into your marrow, paralyzing every nerve ending in your fingertips. The air will progressively thin, tainted with the heavy stench of natural arsenic, and the nauseating metallic reek of carbon dioxide exhaled by you and the men thrashing beside you. Every inhalation will feel like a rusted razor blade slicing your lungs to ribbons. When violently thrust into that apex of physical purgatory, a human being does not stand with arms peacefully at their sides, feeling calm. The prehistoric survival instinct will brutally seize control of the psyche. They will shriek until their vocal cords tear to shreds, coughing up wads of blood. They will claw at the unyielding rock, frantically hunting for a microscopic fissure until all 10 fingernails are ripped backward, leaving their flesh in tatters. They will trample one another, sobbing, cursing the heavens in their suffocating delirium. And finally, when the gnawing agony of thirst and hunger erodes the last fragile membrane of their humanity, They will tear apart the very comrades who once extended a hand to share a crust of salted bread. No biological entity dying of asphyxiation and starvation to pitch black possesses the cognitive composure to meticulously write "it was waiting." Not a single soul can grip a pen to form perfectly legible typography when their hands are violently contorting and convulsing from hypothermia. The serenity woven into those journals is not a spiritual enlightenment. It is a farcical, grotesque forgery, a piece of cheap pulp fiction stitched together to muffle the heart-shredding screams of reality. And if you scrutinize Castle's handwriting analysis, the most colossal blind spot of this deception is glaringly exposed. Castle documented that, commencing in the third week of April, the prose within 94 of the journals abruptly mutated. The sentences turned violently abbreviated, stunted. Every nuance of delicate personal observation, the idle gossip, the snippets of banter evaporated entirely. The cadence of the notebooks compressed, becoming cramped and rigidly tense. 3 journals terminated mid-word, 11 concluded suspended mid-sentence. The Romantics theorized this was the physiological toll of spiritual terror stripping them of their linguistic faculties. No, that abrupt mutation has a profoundly logical and infinitely more repulsive explanation. The prose of those 94 journals shifted because their true owners were no longer the ones wielding the pen. Let us employ the ruthless pragmatism of a criminal mind to reconstruct the true theater of May 19, 1823. The expedition penetrated the cavern system, but they did not advance as a unified monolith. A limestone cave network perpetually mirrors the architecture of an hourglass, featuring cavernous voids near the entrance and agonizingly constricted, slick chutes plunging into bottomless lower tiers. Hargrove, wielding his authority as commander, ordered 90 of his surveyors, those naive men burdened with the heaviest instrumentation, to descend deep into the narrowest gorge, forcing them to crawl over jagged, razored inclines to illuminate and map the deepest basement of the earth. Meanwhile, he and his 6 loyal accomplices, men who had already been promised their preemptive cut of the federal treasury, feigned the necessity of establishing a relay station, lingering in the expansive, leveled upper chamber, dangerously close to the cave's mouth. When the metallic grinding of iron chains and the murmur of those 90 men had been completely swallowed by the pitch-black throat of the subterranean world, leaving only faint, muffled reverberations echoing up from below, Hargrove coldly raised his hand. A flickering ember was touched to the fuse. The black powder, reeking of sulfur, hissed and crackled as it raced along the stone trench. And then a deafening detonation convulsed the very skeletal structure of the mountain. Thousands of tons of colossal boulders and earthen debris from the ceiling came crashing down, entirely obliterating the narrow bottleneck that tethered the upper chamber to the lower abyss. In a fraction of a millisecond, the 90 men below were eternally entombed in the darkness. That dry, concussive boom was a ruthless, irreversible death sentence. The acoustics that ricocheted up from the depths in the aftermath of that explosion, slipping through the microscopic fissures of the dense rock, were likely sounds that would force the demons of hell to tremble and cover their ears. The sickening crunch of boulders pulverizing rib cages, the horrific shrieks of vocal cords tearing themselves apart, the desperate hollow thuds of fists battering against the gargantuan stone wall that now barricaded their lives, and the soul-shredding wails demanding a salvation that would never arrive. But in the sprawling upper chamber, where the frigid drafts of the surface world still freely circulated, there was no panic. There was only the suffocating, freezing apathy of wild beasts draped in human skin. For the span of several grueling weeks that followed, those 7 men reclined in callous leisure around the vibrant crackle of the campfire, flanked by the iron-bound oak coffers gorged with the silver and solid gold of the Department of the Interior. They languidly chewed on salted pork, sipping the glacial spring water that wept from the limestone walls. And then they commenced their labor. Not a single heartbeat fluttered in remorse. They hoarded all 90 of the leather satchels containing the logs that the condemned men had left behind at the surface base camp. Hargrove meticulously rifled through every single page of the notebooks. He delegated the task to his 6 accomplices, shackling each with the responsibility of continuing 15 distinct journals, That is precisely why the prose mutated into something so abruptly stunted and rigid. It was the grueling, joint-atching fatigue of the wrists of men forced into perpetual transcription, frantically attempting to forge the penmanship of others. Imagine the abrasive, scratching rasp of the quill, violently scoring the coarse parchment. The pungent, acrid reek of India ink coalesced with the faint, grotesque echoes of sobbing, the sounds of desperate, scraping fingernails wafting up from the purgatory beneath their boots. They were committing the phrase, "We are not afraid to paper," while directly beneath the slab of rock upon which they sat, their fellow men were cannibalizing one another in the rabid delirium of starvation. Hargrove was a beast of formidable intellect. He understood perfectly well that merely sealing the cave's throat and absconding with the treasury was an exceptionally precarious gambit. The United States government would mobilize the military in pursuit. Seasoned rescue operatives might utilize excavators or detonate further explosives to clear the sinkhole, dredging a path to the bottom only to discover 90 contorted, desiccated skeletons trapped in the dark, conspicuously devoid of a single gold coin or exorbitant brass compass. In that moment, the mirage of a tragic accident would shatter. The investigation would instantly be reclassified as the most colossal mass murder and robbery in history, and warrants for their 7 heads would plaster every post office wall across the American expanse. A barrier was imperative, not a physical barricade, for humanity can always bore through stone. It had to be a psychological bulwark. He needed to engineer an apex of absolute terror, a spiritual defilement, an obsessive curse that would ensure whoever inadvertently unearthed this cavern would be so paralyzed with dread that they would bury it with their own hands, flee for their lives, and never dare to utter a solitary syllable of it. The terror of an invisible entity is an eternal concrete play than any wall of stone. And so the unfathomable, stoic commander, Hargrove, took up a hammer and a metal chisel, painstakingly carving grotesque, razor-sharp geometric sigils into the polished walls of the antechamber, subtles belonging to no human language nor civilization. These were not the cryptic ciphers of an omnipotent deity. They were the meaningless, scratching defacements of a theatrical director dressing the backdrop of his macabre stage. They conjured a phantasmal character baptized Lanox, a non-existent 98th journal, conspicuously absent from the official roster, inscribed with meticulous care by an entity masquerading as an observer who deciphered the shadows, scattering ambiguous prose to implant a creeping dread into their play. Then they constricted their own penmanship, forging the signatures of the men who were expiring below, and drafted those final duplicitous lines, sowing the seeds of a fabricated malevolence. I understand what these marks are for. It was waiting. Once this blood-soaked masterpiece was finalized, Hargrove personally arranged the 97 leather satchels into immaculate, mathematically flawless rows. The 3-foot intervals were quantified with painstaking exactitude, using a surveyor's tape, constructing a frigid, sacrificial tableau. 7 of those satchels, belonging to Hargrove and his 6 accomplices, were similarly among the dead housing journals, deliberately abandoned mid-word, fabricating the illusion that they, too, had evaporated in that very fraction of a second. It was a flawless decoy. Anyone who stumbled upon it would be convinced, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that 97 men had been swallowed by a spiritual leviathan precisely as they sat in serene contemplation, awaiting death. Hargrove stood and admired his magnum opus one final time under the anemic, flickering glow of the hurricane lantern. The stillness within the upper chamber had now become absolutely, bone-chillingly authentic, for the screams from the abyss below had entirely extinguished days prior. 90 lives had been usurped, squeezed dry of their blood and breath in the smothering dark, bartered to secure an imperial future for 7 abominations wearing human skin. They hoisted the grotesquely heavy chests of gold onto their shoulders, slithered out of the cavern's maw, and detonated the final layer of camouflage rock, permanently entombing this theater of butchery within the bowels of the Ozark highlands. They stepped out into the blinding, radiant sunlight of the summer, filling their lungs with the intoxicating air of absolute freedom, leaving behind the freezing depths of a mass grave and the unblinking, vengeful eyes of the restless dead. But Hargrove had forsaken the most fundamental axiom of the natural order. When you bury 90 human beings alive through an act of such unadulterated, sadistic deceit, the seething resentment you breed does not merely lie dormant at the bottom of a crypt. It will slowly fester and seep toward the surface, bleeding out like a venomous pus, sinking its fang into the root of ancient oaks, dissolving into the murky subterranean aquifers, and silently counting the rhythmic pulse of time until it can reach up and devour the very descendants who sit casually smiling upon the earth above. And it did reach up, tearing through the terrestrial crust of earth and stone, exhaling the glacial breath of 134 years of patient, gritted teeth anticipation. Let us depart from the year 1823, suffocating beneath the stench of gunpowder and fresh blood, and return to the ashen, freezing atmosphere of November 1957. The ceaseless, putrefying rains had reduced the town of Dent County into a soot-acid, weeping basin. If you were to stroll the narrow avenues of this municipality in those early winter days, you would inhale the aroma of smoldering pine wood wafting from the chimneys, the scent of burnt roasted coffee rising from the local diner, and the pungent, damp odor of loamy soil decomposing beneath rubber boots. A quintessential, tranquil American town, so excruciatingly mundane it could lull a man to sleep behind the wheel, yet that was merely the epidermis. Deep beneath the fissured asphalt, beneath the unyielding foundations of the churches, beneath the meticulously manicured lawns, the earth was being hollowed out by a festering rot. The colossal limestone mass of the Ozark Plateau was not merely saturated with rainwater, it was saturated with the decay of history. Let us rewind to that 3-week epoch of pathological silence harbored by surveyor-apprentice Ogilvy and veterinarian Cormac Stroud, following their unearthing of the cavern cradling the 97 leather satchels. The historical logs dictate they were paralyzed by the terrifying majesty of a supernatural phenomenon. But awe never carries the metallic, nauseating tang of a cold sweat beating at the nape of the neck, nor does it violently twist the muscular lining of the stomach, threatening to purge its contents every time those two men locked eyes. Ogilvy was no fool. He was the county land surveyor, a man who had dedicated half his existence to burying his nose in archival dosses, charting boundaries, and tracing the genealogical genesis of every square foot of soil in Dent County. Standing amidst those 97 satchels, arranged with sacrificial precision in the gloom, inhaling the arid, desiccated scent of India ink radiating from pages inked in forced forgery, Ogilvy did not perceive a ghost. A phantom of the spiritual realm did not induce his violent shivering. What rooted him to the stone, his lips pressed into a bloodless line beneath the lantern's flicker, was the dawning realization of a repulsive pattern, a nauseating geographic synchronicity between the coordinates of this tomb and the blood-soaked history of his own hometown. If you were to ransack the state archives of Missouri, brushing aside the thick stratum of dust from the 1820s, you would encounter an anomalous void. Dent County was not birthed by destitute, nomadic agrarians seeking the promised land. The demographic and economic detonation of this region occurred with blinding, abrupt ferocity immediately following that fateful year of 1823. Out of the ether, 7 affluent merchants of untraceable lineage materialized. They did not arrive driving emaciated cattle or rickety wagons. They arrived hauling iron-clad oak coffers groaning under the weight of silver dollars and solid gold. They hemorrhaged wealth to purchase the most fertile expanses of land, erected the county courthouse, constructed gargantuan lumber mills, and seized total dominion over the embryonic local government. The patriarch of this mercantile syndicate, the man who christened himself the town's founder, was an enigma who perpetually concealed his calloused, heavily scarred hands beneath exorbitant leather gloves, even in the sweltering heat of summer. A man who never once removed his gloves, brandishing a flawless alias, employing his stolen fortune to purchase reverence and launder his past. Do you see the connective tissue now? The colossal capital that birthed Dent County was the pilfered treasury of the Department of the Interior's expedition. Every single brick mortared into the county courthouse, every wooden tie laid for the railroads, every yard of silk draped across the shoulders of the founders. All of it was financed by the blood, the final, ragged exhalations, and the vocal cords shredded by the screams of 90 men slowly expiring of starvation and dehydration in the pitch-black abyss directly beneath their feet. The 7 accomplices had built a prosperous empire that squatted directly atop the mass grave they had personally sealed. The citizenry of Dent County had strolled, laughed, danced, and bred upon the surface of a human meat grinder. And now stare unflinchingly at the genealogical schematic. The very chart I am certain Ogilvy exhumed from the archives and glared at night after night in his claustrophobic office, drowning in a thick miasma of cigarette smoke during those 3 weeks of concealing the cave. Cormac Stroud was not an ill-fated veterinarian who accidentally purchased a parcel of land with a sinkhole. Apprentice Ogilvy was not a diligent inspector who merely received a tip. If you trace the rotting, dashed lines of their lineage backward through 3 generations, you will find their names plunging their roots directly into 2 of those 7 founding merchants. Dr. Stroud was the direct biological great-grandson of one of the gold-hauling henchmen, and Surveyor Ogilvy, with his sunken eyes, his clinical logic, his obsession with meticulous record-keeping, carried within his veins the very blood of Aldous Hargrove. The suffocation was no longer confined to the subterranean depths. It was strangling Ogilvy's lungs right there in that room, choking on the stench of archaic documents. Attempt to taste the bitter, astringent bile rising in his throat at that moment. The gargantuan inheritance his family enjoyed, the seat of bureaucratic power he occupied, the warm hearth that sheltered him. It was all stolen, dirty money, blood money. When Ogilvy returned to the gaping maw of the sinkhole on those subsequent ashen afternoons, lowering the swaying rope into the inky void, he no longer felt the intoxicating curiosity of an explorer. Every crunch of gravel tumbling into the abyss sounded indistinguishable from the grinding of 90 contorted skeletons. When he stared at Cormac Stroud, who stood petrified at the rim, his complexion waxen, his gaze vacant, Ogilvy knew that Stroud, too, had dimly connected the pieces. Devoid of any spoken word, the crushing silence between the 2 men was the unspoken complicity of those buckling beneath the weight of an inherited atrocity. The sinkhole that ruptured on November 19, 1957, was no geological fluke. The earth did not merely yawn open by sheer coincidence in the Stroud family's backyard. It was a geographic execution order. For 134 years, the 90 corpses in the cavern's depths had putrefied, disintegrating into frigid handfuls of ash and bone. But the absolute, concentrated resentment, the horrific injustice of men betrayed by their own brethren, could not evaporate. It condensed within the viscous atmosphere of the sealed crypt. It bonded with the metallic reek of carbon dioxide, seeping into every microscopic fissure of the limestone. It flowed along the murky subterranean currents, snaking its way upward, methodically corroding the structural integrity of the stone from below. This wrath did not erupt as a geyser of magma. It transmuted into a spiritual acid, patiently eating away every millimeter of limestone on a direct trajectory toward the surface. They did not dig in the wrong place. That erosion was navigated by the compass of bloodlines. The sinkhole did not tear open in the middle of a highway, nor beneath the town hall. It calculated its subsidence with sadistic precision, tearing the earth apart precisely in the backyard of the Stroud lineage, indirectly screaming the name of the Ogilvy clan. It was a subterranean death warrant served from the realm of the dead. The cave unhinged its black jaw as if to declare, "We have been here, we have been waiting. We watched your great-grandfather walk away with the gold, abandoning us to tear the flesh from one another's bones in the dark. We waited for your blood to multiply, waited for you to build your families, to gorge yourselves on absolute luxury. And now, while you sit at the zenith of your comfort, we have risen to reclaim it all." That is precisely why the stillness inside the cavern, when Ogilvy and Stroud descended, felt so viscerally wrong and suffocating. The darkness in that cave was not empty. There was no supernatural monstrosity cowering in the shadows. That silence was the unblinking, relentless stare of 90 invisible phantoms, standing with their arms crossed in a ring around the 2 descendants of their murderers. They permitted the 2 men to climb down. They allowed them to sweep their flashlight beams over the leather satchels. Because the ultimate retribution is not to tear the enemy limb from limb instantaneously. The ultimate punishment is to force the enemy to witness, with their own eyes, the irrefutable evidence of their forefathers' sins, allowing that filthy truth to corrode their sanity, mutilate their conscience, and annihilate every moral foundation and familial pride they ever clung to. When those 97 leather satchels sat there, flawlessly aligned in 3-foot intervals, they ceased to be Aldous Hargrove's theatrical smokescreen. Time and karma had alchemized them into a freezing, relentless mockery. Do you see? The dead silence seemed to whisper into Ogilvy's ear, threading an icy draft down his spine that made every hair on his body stand erect. Your great-grandfather arranged us so neatly to deceive the world, but he could not deceive the earth. Now the play is over. These satchels are hollow, exactly like the fabricated honor of your bloodline. For 3 excruciating weeks, Stroud and Ogilvy endured a psychological purgatory infinitely more barbaric than any demonic nightmare. They walked through the town gazing at their neighbors, ceaselessly agonizing over how many other bloodlines in this minuscule county were also germinated from the seeds of slaughter. They gritted their teeth against the biting winter chill, yet no atmospheric cold could rival the glacial frost rising from their own veins upon realizing their safety and warmth were constructed atop a foundation of starved corpses buried in the limestone. They dared not alert the police, for the authorities would exhume everything. The media would swarm like locusts. Forensic anthropologists would unearth the undeniable evidence of the massacre, and the history of the entirety of Dent County would be violently eviscerated. The names of their ancestors would be eternally damned. Their familial estates would undoubtedly be seized. They were prisoners, held hostage by the atrocities of their own lineage. And then, when the crushing weight of that asphyxiating atmosphere became entirely unbearable, when the abyss of the sinkhole seemed to devour even their dreams, Ogilvy reluctantly drafted his report to the State Historical Society, masquerading the nightmare as a mere archaeological novelty. He prayed that the bureaucratic inertia, the academic penchant for romanticizing history, would uphold the spiritual veil that his great-grandfather Hargrove had originally spun. But Ogilvy was dead wrong. He might have beguiled naive historians like Doratha Castle. He might have successfully manipulated the public into fearing an invisible monster. But he could never, ever launder the blood debt owed to the things that lay awake through the centuries at the bottom of the abyss. A supernatural beast may slumber, but karmic retribution never closes its eyes. The death warrant had been issued, and what awaited him in the final chapter was not salvation, but the most blood-soaked sacrifice of a man whose soul had been chewed to shreds by the silence. And that silence, sluggish yet venomous, had begun to consume apprentice Ogilvy from the inside out, metastasizing in the dark like a malignant tumor. Within the archives of the Missouri State Historical Society, scholars have perpetually puzzled over the third, nameless journal, the notebook that seemingly evaporated from a mothball-scented cardboard box in 1963. The academic elite presumed an antiquarian thief purloined it for its historical merit, but they were woefully mistaken. The thief cared nothing for financial gain. He only sought to bury the rotting roots of his own existence. Reconstruct the moment Ogilvy gripped that ledger beneath the sickly amber of the hurricane lantern in the archive room. The leather binding was coarse, peeling, plastered with the rancid, mildewed dust of a bygone century. As he turned the brittle, jaundiced pages, his eyes did not scan the psychotic ramblings of the paranormal. The third journal did not belong to a zealot. It was the logistical ledger, the blood-stained ledger of heaven and hell that Aldous Hargrove, his own great-grandfather, had utilized to meticulously record the true names of his 6 accomplices, the precise tonnage of gold apportioned to each, and the forged identities they would have adopted to architect a new life on the surface. The exact second Ogilvy deciphered the true surname of his dynasty, alongside the ancestral moniker of the Stroud family, inked in those blackened letters. A blast of air as frigid as a glacial block impaled his spinal cord, flash freezing every vessel in his anatomy. The rustle of the turning pages sounded like the rasp of a scythe grinding against a whetstone. Driven by the primal instinct of a beast shielding its pack, Ogilvy shoved the ledger into his overcoat. He absconded with it, plunging it into the shadows, desperately clinging to the delusion that if no living soul ever read that roster, the curse would remain securely sealed. But he had forgotten the very final sentence that Hargrove himself had forged. It was waiting. For all those years, the masses assumed it was a gelatinous monstrosity, ravenous for human marrow. Beneath that dripping cavern, reeking of sulfur and arsenic, there was no monster to be found. Only 90 shattered souls, 90 corpses filed down by time into bleach-white skeletons, entombed beneath the freezing limestone. The subterranean water continued to drip rhythmically from the ceiling, the agonizingly slow tick-tick, acting as a macroscopic hourglass measuring the volume of their hatred. They had been waiting. Those 90 men did not scream for spiritual deliverance. They submerged their outrage into the absolute nadir of the dark, patiently counting every droplet of water, waiting for the bloodline of Aldous Hargrove to blossom and thrive, waiting for the henchmen to take wives and sire children, waiting for the executioners to savor the absolute warmth of a family hearth, to taste the intoxicating nectar of power and extreme wealth. They had to allow them to ascend to the absolute pinnacle of fulfillment, for only then would the plummet into the abyss truly annihilate their souls. The historical warrant of death is never served to a beggar. It is solely executed when the prey possesses far too much to lose. That terrifying patience pulverized Ogilvy's sanity. Even though he retired, abdicated his throne as the land surveyor, and fled to Springfield dozens of miles away, the cave refused to release its grip on him. Every night, when he closed his eyes, he did not hear the wind shrieking through the window panes. He heard the abrasive grinding of limestone walls slowly closing in, the wheezing, ragged breaths of starving men echoing in his eardrums. The aroma of morning coffee in his kitchen was usurped by the acrid stench of putrefying leather and ancient dust. In 1974, 3 weeks prior to his death, Ogilvy's geriatric frame had withered into obsolescence. His joints screamed in agony, his breathing came in fractured gasps. But the psychological torture had breached its zenith. He confronted a brutal, undeniable truth. If he were to peacefully close his eyes on this warm bed, the blood debt would automatically transfer to the shoulders of the son he so dearly loved. The sinkhole had unhinged its jaw once. It would unhinge it again and again until it had swallowed the very last drop of blood from the 7 traitors. And so, Ogilvy resolved to commit an act that would make even the demons of the pit shudder. The final addendum his son discovered dictated that he had returned to the cavern, witnessed the vanishing of the original Satchels, and left one new satchel before departing. How profoundly naive. If he had merely deposited an object upon the stone floor and pivoted on his heel, why did law enforcement fail to recover Ogilvy's corpse in his residence, in a hospital ward, or anywhere upon the surface of the earth? Allow me to illuminate what truly transpired on that lightless, freezing night in 1974. Ogilvy piloted his vehicle back to the maw of the sinkhole in Dent County. The northern gale shrieked through the skeletal branches of the oaks, slicing into flesh like invisible razor blades. He carried a pristine leather satchel, its brass buckles brilliantly polished, containing absolutely no surveying ledgers or exorbitant compasses. It contained nothing but the crushing, generational mass of sin, heavy enough to snap his fragile shoulders. He rappelled down into the abyss. Every scrape of his boot soles against the rock face echoed with a dry, hollow crack. The glacial exhalation of the cave floor rose to lap at the hems of his trousers, blowing into face the stench of a death that had been lying in wait for a century and a half. When his boots finally touched the dust-choked, perfectly flat floor, the beam of his flashlight swept across an absolute void. The 97 antiquated satchels had vanished. They had fulfilled their purpose as bait. Now the stage was reserved for a singular, solitary audience member. Ogilvy took agonizingly slow, dragging steps until he stood in the absolute epicenter of the cratered chamber. Surrounding him was a darkness so thick it was a physical entity, as though dozens of invisible eyes were boring into the man who carried the veins of Aldous Hargrove. He sank to his knees. His trembling, mud-smeared hands lowered the pristine leather satchel onto the freezing stone. The metallic clack of the brass buckle fastening echoed sharp and absolute, mirroring the fatal sliding of a death row cell's deadbolt. But Ogilvy did not stand back up. He did not turn his back and flee. He slowly slumped down beside the satchel, curling himself into the exact 3-foot spatial void that his great-grandfather had measured out all those years ago. He extinguished the flashlight. The illumination died instantly, entirely swallowing the silhouette of the old surveyor. Surrounded by absolute, suffocating darkness, Ogilvy closed his eyes, yielding to the limestone chill as it seeped into his spinal fluid, surrendering his lungs to be slowly poisoned by the thick, stagnant air. He did not weep. He did not cry out for absolution. He understood that there exists no forgiveness for an atrocity that bridges 3 generations. He weaponized his own life force, burying himself alive in the mass grave of his ancestors, offering himself as one final, desperate sacrifice. He prayed that this silence, this abyssal dark, once it had masticated his flesh, would finally be satiated and release its grip on the generations to come. Ogilvy settled the ledger by voluntarily transmuting himself into the 98th Satchel. Above ground, Cormac Stroud lacked the fortitude for self-sacrifice. The veterinarian opted for comfort who desperately cling to a comfortable existence. Years later, Stroud summoned fleets of dump trucks, burying the sinkhole beneath avalanches of soil, concrete, and industrial slag, frantically stuffing the ravenous mouth of history. He leveled the earth, sowed a fresh layer of sod, desperately attempting to construct a fragile camouflage over the malignant tumor festering below. When the journalist inquired, he simply stated, "Whatever is down there didn't want me coming back in," but he was deceiving only himself. Filling a crater with rubble cannot dam the subterranean flow of limestone aquifers. Concrete cannot suffocate the starvation of 90 corpses that have never been mourned, never been acknowledged. The cavern remains there, vastly expanding beneath hundreds of square miles of the Ozark Plateau, silently slithering through the water table. Ogilvy died to absolve the Hargrove bloodline. Stroud continues to run. But do not forget, in that bygone year, there were 7 traitors who hauled the gold to the surface. Only 2 names have been crossed off the ledger. There are still 5 lineages wandering blissfully out there in the world. They might be lounging in a lavishly appointed living room right now,
being an exquisite vintage of wine, utterly oblivious
to the fact that deep beneath the foundations of their home, dozens of yards below the abrasive limestone, the acid of pure hatred is still ticking away, patiently chewing through the rock, methodically counting down the seconds until the next sinkhole violently tears open. People have an inherent affinity for ghost stories. Do you know why? Because placing your faith in the demonic is infinitely more comforting than being forced to confront the putrid, filthy reality of mankind. We would rather cower in the fetal position at the prospect of an ancient, invisible, malevolent entity than grit our teeth and confess the truth. That the pristine home you inhabit, the level luxury vehicle you command, was quite possibly purchased with the blood, the betrayal, and the asphyxiating screams of those who came before you. We easily tremble before a fabricated monster, yet we sleep soundly, intimately embracing the genetic descendants of cutthroats and thieves. Sometimes, the most barbaric punishment hell can inflict is not a cauldron of boiling oil or a legion of pitchfork-wielding fiends. Hell is the reality of sitting immobilized in a pitch-black, freezing cavern, stomach contorting in the agonies of starvation, your fingernails peeled backward from clawing at the stone, possessing the absolute lucid knowledge that the very men who just murdered you are sitting directly above your head, dividing the gold and embarking on a life of imperial luxury. And, knowing you are powerless to do anything but wait with agonizing patience for 134 years, solely to reach up and drag their great-grandchildren down into the bloody mire. Tonight's narrative does not conclude with a cheap moral platitude or hollow advice. It terminates with a suspended, viscous truth clinging to the collar of your shirt. My question to you, those of you who are still awake, listening to the cadence of your own breathing in the dark tonight, is this. Suppose tomorrow, when you awaken, a bottomless, pitch-black sinkhole has torn itself open right in your backyard. And at the absolute nadir of that abyss lies the ironclad, irrefutable evidence proving that your family's fortune, your idyllic comfort, the flawless education you currently enjoy, all of it was erected upon the bones of dozens of innocent people, betrayed and buried alive by your great-grandfather. What will you do? Will you frantically dial the cement trucks, pouring concrete to seal that screaming mouth, opting to perpetuate a life of counterfeit warmth, donning the mask of a righteous citizen just as Cormac Stroud did? Or Will you possess the sheer courage to pick up an empty leather satchel, walk out of your heated home, and march directly down into that freezing blackness to settle the blood debt of your family with your own 2 hands? Tell me your true choice in the comments below. Do not lie, because the darkness has never once believed in pleasantries. I am genuinely morbidly curious to see how many among us possess the fortitude to stare unblinkingly into the karmic abyss of our own bloodlines. If this is your first foray into this suffocating space, we exist here to violently tear away the flawless epidermis of the beautiful lies that history deliberately leaves behind. Hit subscribe and ring the bell, provided you possess the courage to confront the horror of reality. And remember, no stretch of land is ever naturally silent. It is silent. Because it is waiting. I will see you all in the next blood-soaked dossier of Appalachian horror stories.